Jack, last Sunday, my aunt looked at me across the dinner table and asked one simple question. So, Rose, remind me, what exactly did you study at university? And for 3 full seconds, my mind went completely blank. Isn't that strange? I spent 4 years studying that subject, and in that moment, I could not remember a single clear detail.
Oh God, that is odd. But I found our today's discussion topic. Today we are going to talk about something that happens to almost every English learner, explaining your studies in a clear, natural way, without freezing, without repeating 10 times, and without feeling embarrassed. Stay with us, because by the end of this episode, you will never blank out on this question again.
I strongly agree. Okay, then, welcome back to Rose and Jack Everyday English. We're so happy you're here with us again today. I hope yesterday's episode helped you feel a little more confident. Today is day 12 of our 30-day B1 to B2 challenge, and our topic is talking about your studies. This is such an important topic because almost every English learner gets asked this question at some point, at a party, in a job interview, or even during a simple conversation with a stranger on a train. By the end of today's episode, you will feel much more confident talking about this in English. So let's get started right away.
Okay, I have to say, that story about your aunt made me laugh because something almost exactly like that happened to me last month. I was at a family dinner too. Actually, it was my cousin's birthday. And my uncle turned to me and asked what I was studying these days. And I just sat there for a second thinking, wait, do I explain the whole complicated story or do I just give the short, boring answer? It's such a common moment, isn't it? Someone asks a simple question and suddenly you realize you don't actually know how to explain your own life in a clear way.
Exactly. And I think that's the real problem. It's not that we don't know English, it's that we've never really practiced explaining our own studies out loud. So today, let's actually do that properly for our listeners and for ourselves. Can you start? Tell everyone what you're studying right now or what you studied, because I know your story is actually pretty interesting.
All right, let me take you back a few years first because you can't understand my current situation without knowing where I started. When I finished high school, I was completely sure I wanted to study engineering. My father's an engineer, my older brother's an engineer, and honestly, I think I chose it partly because it felt like the safe, expected path in my family. Nobody pushed me directly, but there was this quiet pressure, Like everyone assumed that's what I would do.
That's so common, though. I think a lot of people choose their studies based on what their family expects or what looks like a stable, respectable choice, rather than what they actually enjoy. Did you like it at the beginning, or did you already have doubts?
Honestly, the first year wasn't terrible. I was busy, the classes were difficult, and I told myself the difficulty was normal, that everyone struggles in the first year. But by the second year, I started noticing something. I would finish my technical assignments as fast as possible, just to get them done. But then I would spend hours reading articles about language learning or watching videos about how people teach English abroad. I didn't see the pattern at first, I just thought I was procrastinating.
That's such an interesting detail, though, because that's usually a big sign, isn't it? When you enjoy the thing you're avoiding your work with more than the actual work itself. I had something similar happen to me, but I'll tell you my full story in a minute. First, finish yours because I want to know what happened next.
So by the third year, I was genuinely struggling. Not because the material was too hard exactly, but because I had almost no motivation left. I remember one specific night. It was around midnight, and I was staring at a page full of equations, completely unable to focus. And I asked myself a very direct question. If I finish this degree, will I actually want to work as an engineer for the next 30 years? And the honest answer, deep down, was no.
That must have been such a scary realization, though, especially after investing 3 years already. What did you do with that thought? Did you talk to anyone about it, or did you just keep it to yourself for a while?
I kept it to myself for almost a full year, if I'm honest, which I now think was a mistake. I was scared of disappointing my parents, and I was scared of wasting the money they had already spent on my education. So instead of talking about it openly, I just quietly finished my engineering degree, mostly out of stubbornness, and told myself I would figure out the rest later. Looking back, I think that was the wrong approach, because I spent an entire extra year feeling stressed and a bit lost, when I could have started planning my real path much earlier.
I completely understand that fear, though, the fear of disappointing your family. But I'm curious, what happened after you finished the degree? Because clearly you're not working as an engineer now, so something must have changed.
Right after graduation, I actually did work as a junior engineer for about 8 months, mainly to prove to myself, and maybe to my family too, that I could do it if I chose to. And I did fine. My manager was happy with my work, but every single day felt like I was performing a role rather than living my real life. Then one weekend, almost by accident, I offered to help a neighbor's teenage son practice his English speaking before an important exam, and something just clicked. I genuinely enjoyed explaining grammar, correcting his mistakes gently, and watching him get more confident within a single afternoon.
Oh, I love that. It's like your real interest had been sitting there quietly the whole time, waiting for the right moment to show itself. So after that afternoon with the neighbor's son, did you make the decision immediately or did it take more time?
It took about 6 more months actually, because I wanted to be responsible about it rather than making an emotional decision overnight. I researched teaching certifications, I talked to a few English teachers online, and I even saved some money first so I wouldn't feel financial pressure during the transition. Eventually, I enrolled in a short teaching course alongside my engineering job. And honestly, those months studying something I actually chose for myself instead of something expected of me felt completely different. It didn't even feel like studying. It felt like learning English speaking methods that I was excited to use.
That's such a powerful shift, though, going from studying out of obligation to studying out of genuine curiosity. I think a lot of our listeners can relate to that feeling, especially anyone learning English right now, because you're choosing to improve your English speaking skills. Nobody is forcing you to listen to this podcast episode. Okay, now it's my turn. And honestly, my story is a little different, but the feeling underneath it is very similar.
Please go ahead because I've heard bits of this before, but never the whole thing properly.
So, when I finished high school, I actually knew exactly what I wanted to study, which was literature. I loved reading, I loved analyzing stories, and I was genuinely excited to start university. My parents were a little worried, mostly about job opportunities afterward, but they still supported my choice, which I'm grateful for. The first 2 years were honestly wonderful. I read constantly, I wrote long essays about characters and themes, and I felt like I was exactly where I belonged.
That sounds like a really positive start, though. So, what changed? Because I know you're not working purely in literature now either.
The problem wasn't the subject itself, it was more about what came after. Toward the end of my degree, I started attending career events at university, and every single conversation turned into the same worried question. So, what will you actually do with a literature degree? At first, I laughed it off, but after hearing it maybe 50 times, it started to genuinely affect my confidence. I began doubting a subject I had once loved, simply because other people kept questioning its practical value.
That's rough, though, because loving a subject and being questioned constantly about its usefulness are two completely different things. Did that pressure eventually push you toward marketing?
It was actually one specific moment during my final year. A visiting speaker came to talk about careers, and she had studied literature too, but ended up working in marketing, specifically writing content and messaging for companies. She explained how understanding stories, characters, and emotional language directly helps you write better advertisements and better brand messaging. Something in my brain just connected instantly. I realized I didn't need to abandon what I loved, I just needed to apply it somewhere slightly different than I originally imagined.
That's such a clever connection, though, using literature skills inside a marketing career. Did you switch your studies completely then, or did you finish literature first and study marketing separately afterward?
I finished my literature degree fully because I still believed, and still believe today, that it genuinely shaped how I think and how I write. But immediately afterward, I enrolled in a shorter, practical marketing course, almost like your teaching certification, actually, now that I think about it. And here's my honest confession, my real mistake in this whole story. During that marketing course, I was so afraid of seeming unqualified compared to classmates with business backgrounds that I barely spoke during group discussions for the first month.
Wait, you staying quiet in a group discussion? That's honestly hard for me to imagine, knowing how confidently you speak now.
I know, it sounds unbelievable now, but it's completely true. I convinced myself that because my background was different, my ideas were somehow less valuable, so I just stayed silent and let other people lead every conversation. It took an instructor pulling me aside after class, telling her directly that my perspective from literature was actually bringing something unique to our discussions, for me to finally start speaking up properly. That single conversation genuinely changed how I participated for the rest of the course.
That's such an important lesson, though. And honestly, it connects to something we talk about constantly on this podcast: confidence in speaking, whether it's in your studies, your career, or even practicing English speaking with strangers, often matters just as much as the actual knowledge you already have.
Exactly. And that's precisely why I think today's topic matters so much for our listeners. Because explaining your studies clearly in English isn't just about grammar or vocabulary, it's also about feeling confident enough to actually speak up, even when the topic feels complicated or personal. If I could go back and give advice to myself during that literature degree, I would tell her to stop apologizing for her subject and instead learn to explain, in simple, confident language, exactly why it mattered to her.
That's really good advice, actually, and I think it applies directly to English learners too. A lot of people avoid explaining their studies in English because they're worried their vocabulary isn't advanced enough or their sentences aren't perfect. But honestly, based on both our stories, what actually matters more is speaking clearly with real examples rather than using complicated words you're not comfortable with.
Completely agree. And speaking of complicated situations, can we talk about something a bit different now? What about explaining your studies during an actual job interview? Because I remember my first marketing interview being genuinely nerve-wracking, specifically because of that literature to marketing question.
Oh, absolutely. Let's talk about that because interviews are honestly where this topic becomes the most stressful for people. What exactly did they ask you, and how did you handle explaining your background?
The interviewer looked at my resume, paused for a moment, and then asked, quite directly, why should we hire someone with a literature degree for a marketing position? And instead of getting nervous, I actually remembered that advice from my instructor. So I explained calmly that literature taught me how to understand people through language, how to notice small details in tone and meaning, and how those exact skills applied directly to writing marketing messages that genuinely connect with customers.
That's such a strong answer, though, because you're not avoiding the question. You're actually turning your unusual background into a genuine advantage. Did the interviewer seem convinced, or did you still feel uncertain afterward?
He actually smiled and said that was the clearest answer he'd heard all week, which honestly gave me so much confidence for the rest of the interview. I think that experience taught me something really valuable about explaining your studies. It's not about hiding an unusual path, it's about explaining the connection clearly with genuine examples instead of just listing facts about your degree.
That's basically what happened during my teaching interview, too, actually. The school director asked me directly why an engineer wanted to teach English. And I explained that engineering taught me how to break big, complicated problems into small, clear steps, which is honestly exactly what good English teaching requires: breaking grammar down into simple pieces, one step at a time for students who are just starting their B1 to B2 English journey.
I love that connection. Engineering logic applied to teaching English. It's such a perfect example of what we're talking about today, taking your specific studies, whatever they were, and explaining them in a way that feels natural and confident, rather than memorized or robotic.
Definitely. And honestly, thinking about our listeners specifically, I imagine a lot of them are currently studying something completely unrelated to English, maybe medicine, business, computer science, or something else entirely, while also trying to improve their English speaking on the side. Do you think our advice today still applies to them?
I think it applies even more directly to them, actually, because whatever you're studying, whether it's chemistry, architecture, nursing, or accounting, you're still going to face that exact same moment at some point. Someone asking, in English, what do you study? Or what did you study? And instead of freezing, like I did with my aunt, you can prepare simple, honest sentences in advance, just like we've been demonstrating throughout this entire conversation.
That's such practical advice. Preparing your own personal explanation in advance rather than trying to create sentences on the spot under pressure. I think that's honestly one of the most useful things anyone learning English speaking can do for almost any personal topic, not just studies.
Completely agree. Now, before we move into today's language review, I want to ask you one final question about your story. Looking back at your whole journey, engineering, then teaching, if you could give advice to 18-year-old Jack choosing his studies for the very first time, what would you actually tell him?
Honestly, I would tell him to talk more openly, much earlier, instead of quietly following what felt expected. I wasted almost a full year staying silent about my doubts, when a single honest conversation with my parents probably would have relieved so much unnecessary stress. What about you? What would you tell 18-year-old Rose right before she started her literature degree?
I would tell her exactly what my instructor eventually told me. Stop apologizing for choosing something you genuinely love. Your studies don't need to have an obvious practical career path attached immediately, as long as you eventually learn how to explain their real value clearly and confidently, which, honestly, it took me several years to fully understand.
That's really beautiful advice, actually. But before we move on, I want to ask you something practical, because I know a lot of our listeners are probably nervous right now thinking about explaining their own studies in English for the first time. When you were still building your confidence, did you ever practice these explanations out loud, alone, before actually needing them in a real conversation?
Yes, constantly. And honestly, that habit is something I still use today. Before any interview or even before a casual party where I knew someone might ask about my background, I would stand in front of my mirror and practice a short, natural explanation out loud, maybe 3 or 4 sentences, until it felt smooth instead of memorized. It sounds a little silly, but speaking your own story out loud, even alone in your bedroom, genuinely builds real confidence for the actual moment.
That's such a practical tip, and I think it applies perfectly to English learners specifically. Practicing your personal explanation out loud in English before you actually need it, instead of trying to translate your thoughts directly in the middle of a stressful conversation. I used to do something similar, actually. I would record myself on my phone explaining my career change, listen back, and notice which parts sounded unnatural or too complicated.
Oh, that's clever using your phone like that. Did you notice any specific patterns when you listened back to your own recordings?
Definitely. The biggest pattern was that I kept using overly formal, complicated vocabulary, probably because I was nervous and wanted to sound impressive. I would say things like, I made the decision to transition from an engineering career pathway into the field of English language education. And when I actually listened to it, I realized it sounded completely unnatural. Nobody speaks like that in a real conversation. So I simplified it into something like, I used to work as an engineer, but I realized teaching English made me much happier, so I switched.
That's such an important lesson, though. And honestly, it connects directly to something we always emphasize on this podcast. Simple, clear English almost always sounds more natural and more confident than complicated vocabulary used incorrectly. I think a lot of English learners make that exact mistake. They assume longer, fancier words automatically sound more impressive, when actually the opposite is usually true.
Completely agree. And speaking of real conversations, let's actually practice this together right now, live for our listeners. Imagine we just met at a friend's birthday party, and I ask you directly, so Rose, what do you actually do? How would you naturally answer that using everything we've talked about today?
Okay, let's try it. I would probably say something like, well, I actually studied literature at university, which surprises people sometimes, but now I work in marketing, writing content for a small company. It's a strange combination, but honestly, understanding stories and people really helps me write better messages for customers. See, that's simple, honest, and it naturally invites a follow-up question instead of sounding like a rehearsed speech.
That was really smooth, actually, and I love that it naturally invites curiosity. Let me try mine now. If someone asked me at that same party, they might say, so, Jack, what's your background? And I would answer, actually, I studied engineering originally, but a few years ago I switched into teaching English, and honestly, it's the best decision I've ever made professionally. Breaking down grammar rules feels surprisingly similar to solving engineering problems, just with people instead of machines.
I genuinely love that comparison. people instead of machines. That's such a memorable way to explain your career change. I think our listeners can really use this exact structure. Mention what you studied, briefly explain any change if there was one, and then add one small personal detail that makes your story memorable, instead of just listing plain facts.
Exactly. And that structure works whether you're explaining your studies at a party, during a job interview, or even just chatting with a stranger on a train, like the situation we started this episode with. Speaking of which, Rose, did your aunt eventually get her answer after that awkward 3-second silence at dinner?
She did, actually, and it's a funny way to end this story. After those 3 seconds of blank silence, I just laughed at myself and said, "Sorry, give me a second." My brain completely froze there. And then I explained everything calmly. Literature, then marketing, using almost exactly the structure we just practiced together. My aunt actually said it was the clearest explanation I'd ever given her, which felt like a really nice, unexpected compliment after such an embarrassing start.
That's such a perfect ending, though, proving that even a moment of complete panic can turn into a confident explanation once you actually know how to structure your thoughts. I think that's honestly the biggest lesson from today's entire conversation. Freezing occasionally is completely normal and human, but preparing simple, honest sentences in advance can turn that panic into genuine confidence in English or in any language. Before we move into that, though, can I ask one more question? Looking back at everything, your literature degree, my engineering degree, do you think we would make the exact same choices again if we somehow got to start completely over?
That's such a big question. Honestly, I think I would still choose literature because those 4 years genuinely shaped how I read, how I write, and even how I understand people, skills I still use every single day in marketing. What would surprise you, though, is that I would probably speak up much earlier during my marketing course instead of staying quiet out of fear. The subject was right for me, but my confidence around it definitely took far too long to develop.
That makes complete sense, and honestly, my answer is quite similar. I think I would still study engineering first because that logical step-by-step thinking genuinely helps me explain grammar clearly to my students today. But like you, I would talk about my doubts much sooner instead of quietly carrying them alone for an entire extra year. I think that's probably the real lesson hiding underneath both of our stories today.
Beautifully said. All right, I think we've shared enough personal stories for one episode, but before we finish, let's take everything we've talked about today and turn it into something practical for our listeners, because I know several really useful expressions came up naturally throughout our whole conversation. What do you think, Jack?
Actually, before we move into the review, I have an idea. Instead of just talking about how to explain your studies, why don't we actually act it out for our listeners? A short example, like a real first meeting, so people can hear the whole structure from start to finish, not just pieces of it.
I love that idea. Okay, let's set the scene. Imagine we've just met at a language exchange event. We don't know each other yet, and it's your turn to ask me first. Ready?
Ready. Hi, I'm Jack. Nice to meet you. So, what do you do or what did you used to study?
Hi, Jack. Nice to meet you too. I'm Rose. So I actually studied literature at university, which surprises some people because now I work in marketing. Basically, I write content and messages for a small company.
Oh, that's an interesting combination. How did you go from literature to marketing? That seems like a pretty big jump.
It does seem like a big jump, but honestly, it made more sense than people expect. During my last year of university, I met someone who had studied literature too, and she ended up working in marketing, writing advertisements and brand messages. I realized my literature skills, understanding people, noticing details, telling a good story, were actually really useful in that field. So I finished my degree, then took a short marketing course afterward.
That's such a clear way to explain it. I really like how you connected literature and marketing with one simple example, instead of just saying they're related. Okay, now it's my turn to answer the same question. Go ahead, ask me.
All right. So, Jack, what do you do or what did you used to study?
Good question. I actually studied engineering originally, but a few years ago I switched into teaching English. It probably sounds like an unusual change, but honestly, it's the best decision I've made professionally.
That does sound unusual. What made you switch from engineering to teaching English?
Well, during my last year of studying engineering, I helped a neighbor's son practice his English speaking before an exam, and I noticed how much I enjoyed explaining things clearly and watching him improve. After that, I did some research, saved some money, and eventually trained as an English teacher. Breaking grammar down into simple steps actually feels a lot like solving an engineering problem, just with people instead of machines.
See, that's exactly the structure we talked about earlier. State what you studied, briefly explain the change if there is one, and add one small personal detail, a story, an example, a feeling that makes the explanation memorable instead of just a list of facts.
Exactly. And notice how neither of us used any complicated or advanced vocabulary. We just spoke clearly, honestly, and added one real example each. That's genuinely all you need to sound confident when someone asks you this question in English.
I hope that short example gives our listeners something they can actually copy at home. Take a minute after this episode. Think about your own studies and try building your own short answer using exactly that same structure. All right, now let's move into today's language review because a lot of really useful expressions came up naturally in our conversation. Our first expression is quiet pressure. Jack used this earlier when he explained why he chose engineering. Quiet pressure means a feeling that you should do something, even though nobody says it directly. For example, in my family, there was quiet pressure to become a doctor, even though nobody ever asked me directly. A common mistake learners make is saying silent pressure, which sounds a bit strange in English. Quiet pressure is the natural correct phrase.
Our next expression is something just clicked. I use this when I describe the moment I enjoyed teaching English for the first time. It means you suddenly understood or felt something clearly, almost instantly. For example, after months of confusion about my career, something just clicked when I helped my neighbor's son with his English. Learners sometimes say something clicked in my head, which is understandable, but native speakers usually just say something just clicked without adding extra words.
Next, we have to freeze, like when my mind went blank at dinner. To freeze means to suddenly become unable to speak or move, usually because of surprise or nervousness. For example, I completely froze when my manager asked me an unexpected question during a meeting. A common mistake is saying, I stopped, which is too general. Freeze specifically describes that sudden, nervous, blank feeling.
Another useful phrase is out of obligation, which Rose used when comparing studying out of obligation versus studying out of curiosity. It means doing something because you feel you have to, not because you truly want to. For example, I finished my degree mostly out of obligation to my family, not because I still enjoyed it. Learners sometimes say because of obligation, but the correct natural phrase is out of obligation.
We also use the phrase to speak up several times today. To speak up means to say what you think clearly, especially in a group, instead of staying silent. For example, during my marketing course, I finally learned to speak up instead of letting other classmates lead every discussion. A common mistake is saying, speak up my opinion, but speak up is already complete by itself. You don't need to add extra words after it.
Let's also review nerve-wracking, which Rose used to describe her marketing interview. Nerve-wracking means something that makes you feel very nervous or anxious. For example, my first day teaching a full classroom of students felt genuinely nerve-wracking. Some learners confuse this with nervous itself, but nerve-wracking describes the situation, while nervous describes how a person feels.
Another important one is to break something down. Jack used this when explaining how engineering helps him teach grammar. To break something down means to divide a complicated thing into smaller, simpler parts. For example, good teachers always break grammar rules down into small steps for their students. Learners sometimes just say to explain, but break down specifically highlights the process of simplifying something complicated.
Finally, let's review to connect with someone or something. Rose used this when talking about writing marketing messages that connect with customers. It means to create a real emotional or personal link with someone. For example, a good English podcast should connect with listeners, not just teach them grammar rules. A common alternative learners use is to touch someone, but connect with is much more natural in everyday English conversation.
Those are today's key expressions: quiet pressure, something just clicked, to freeze, out of obligation, to speak up, nerve-wracking, to break something down, and to connect with someone. Try using at least two of these in your own sentences today, even just in your head, while thinking about your own studies.
Now, let's talk about common mistakes English learners make when discussing their studies. The first mistake is saying, I am studying since 3 years. The correct sentence is, I have been studying for 3 years. We use present perfect continuous with for and a length of time, not since, which is only used with a specific starting point, like since 2022.
That's such a common mistake, honestly. The second mistake is saying, I finished my studies in the last year. The correct sentence is, I finished my studies last year. In English, we don't usually add the before last year, last month, or last week when we're talking about a specific completed time in the past.
Good point. The third mistake is saying, I am agree with changing my studies. The correct sentence is, I agree with changing my studies. Agree is already a full verb in English, so learners don't need to add am, is, or are before it, even though many other languages require that structure.
Another frequent mistake is saying depends of what you study. The correct phrase is depends on what you study. Depend always connects with the preposition on, never of, even though many learners naturally want to translate directly from their own language.
And finally, a mistake we hear constantly is saying, I have 25 years old. The correct sentence is simply, I am 25 years old. In English, we use the verb to be with age, not to have, which is different from many other languages, including several spoken across Europe and Asia.
Those 5 mistakes are extremely common, but honestly, once you notice them, they're not difficult to fix at all. Just remember, for with a duration, no the before last year, agree without am or is, depend on, and am with age, not have.
Now, here's today's comment challenge for all of you listening. In the comments below, tell us what you studied or what you're currently studying, and if your path changed, tell us why. Try using at least one expression from today's episode, maybe quiet pressure, something just clicked, or to speak up. Write 2 or 3 sentences in English following the same structure Rose and I demonstrated earlier. Don't worry about making mistakes. This is a safe space for English learners at every level to practice real English conversation. We genuinely read your comments, and we love seeing how differently everyone's story turns out, even when the topic is exactly the same.
Thank you, friends, for listening to our today's episode. I hope you learned something from it. Don't miss tomorrow's episode, day 13 of the B1 to B2 challenge. Subscribe now so you don't fall behind. If today's episode helped you feel more confident explaining your studies in English, please give it a like and share it with another English learner who might need it too. Every single episode in this challenge builds on the last one, so staying consistent really does make a huge difference in your English fluency over time. We work hard to make each English podcast episode feel like a real conversation between friends, not just a boring lesson, and your support genuinely means everything to us. See you tomorrow, friends.